Hello, I'd like to welcome everybody to the Audit Committee of the California State Bar meeting. This is September the 4th of 2025. My name is Mark Tony, and I serve as chair of the Bar Audit Committee. So welcome everybody. I'm going to ask the secretary to take the roll.
Buenaventura, Harrison,
Here.
User,
Here.
Stevens, and Tony.
Present.
You have a quorum.
Thank you very much. So the first item on our agenda is a call for public comment. This is very important to us to provide members of the public the opportunity to make comments. If you're participating by Zoom, there should be a hand icon on the bottom of your screen that you can click. And if you're on phone, you can press *9, and that way we'll know that you want to speak. So I'm going to start off. We generally have 2 minutes for public comment, but for commenters who let us know ahead of time and request accommodation, we increase that to 3 minutes. So I always like to start by asking for individuals who have signed up in advance, because they should go first. So who do we got who signed up in advance here? Great. Benjamin Cohn, you are welcome to address the audit committee. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to address the travel expense reports that were posted on here. You have certainly had a lot of discussion about ways to find additional money in your budget to avoid various fee increases and other cost cutting. And I see here that upwards of $350 per day is being spent on restaurants when staff travel. And I am seeing that's consisting of $60 breakfasts, $110 lunches, and $180 dinners. I reached out to some other people, and it was brought to my attention that the legislative and executive branches don't even allow $60 per day when their employees are traveling on government business. So I just think that the numbers that are being allowed here and the types of restaurants are generally not appropriate. And there needs to be a policy put in place to be more fiscally responsible. To a lesser extent, perhaps some of the hotel rate allowances of which hotels maybe are stayed at is also a little bit out of proportion on those expense reports. The second thing that I wanted to comment on was that I do see there was an agenda item about more federal grants being utilized, and I wanted to say that that should be explored further is for other programs and activities. There's been a large effort by the state bar to claim that it's not receiving federal funding, but that's not true in a lot of areas. And I think that the desire to make that claim is giving you the worst of both worlds, where you're also turning down a lot of grant money that could be used, particularly for the bar exam, to avoid putting a lot more costs on applicants, areas where there's funding available that is not being fully utilized. So hopefully that allows for some more creative solutions before you get that brought back to you in November about fee increases. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cohn. And I welcome any ideas or information you would like to share in terms of potential sources of funding that we ought to be looking into. If you were to send that to myself or to any of the board members, I know we would appreciate that. So thank you very much. And we'll take your comments into account when we get to the items on the expenses to approve. Thank you very much. Do we have other members who have signed up, members of the public who have signed up in advance?
No other members have signed up in advance and no other raised hands for public comment.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. In that case, I will go ahead and close public comment and go ahead and move on to the rest of the agenda. The first item on the agenda we have is the chair's report. And the only report I have is that I am very happy for us to be having a meeting where some of us are here in person. We have Trustee Stevens, who has just arrived for the record. And so bear with us if we have little glitches doing this hybrid. Do appreciate your patience. So, you know, we have a consent agenda, which consists of the board and management travel and expense reports. Given the public comment, I would like to take them off consent so that we can ask some questions. I'm going to open it up before I ask questions I may have to any other trustee audit committee member. Okay, well, I will go ahead. And, you know, when I am looking at, okay, let's take this 3.1 on the agenda, which is the, it's listed as the approval of 2024 quarter two board management travel expense report. I suppose that when I look at this, I presume that in some cases, when an individual has listed a payment, say for a dinner of the Equal Justice Conference, $140, that was an example that was provided by Benjamin Cohn, that person may be paying for more than one person to eat. And so I was wondering if maybe staff could give us a little bit of insight into when we see these names and we see things like meals, is there a way for us to tell whether it was strictly individual or whether there were other people? I know when I travel, sometimes for my organization, and I take out the Turn credit card, I'm often paying myself for multiple people. Okay, myself, a colleague, myself, two colleagues. So I don't want to presume that this is an individual. I want to ask. So Erica,
Sure.
if you could give some insight,
Yeah.
I'd appreciate it.
So let me set the stage, I think. So the State Bar has a travel and expense policy that all staff, as well as trustees and others, our committee members and so forth, volunteers are required to follow. There is a per day amount for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then similarly, if there's catering for a board meeting or so forth, there is also a maximum amount per person for breakfast and lunch. So what you're seeing on here, where you see $60, for example, or $140 to your example, is for several days cumulative. And it shows that. So it shows that there's multiple days in that travel for that particular event in many of these instances, or it should be all of those instances. So for example, if you're looking at, breakfast for travel during a CBE meeting, that covers 3 days or multiple days and so forth. So it's covering that. Where it's for multiple people, a reimbursement that typically doesn't happen in this level because people typically submit their own travel and expense reimbursements. And those amounts for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, frankly, typically don't cover how much breakfast, lunch, and dinner actually cost, but that's what they're authorized to submit for. So $22, $23, and $36 respectively.
Say that one more time, and I think, and connect each of them with the meal they're associated with. If you
Sure.
would say that one more time, please.
Breakfast, $22, lunch, $23, dinner, $36.
Okay. I know, for instance, because I have a meeting that goes till 12 today and another meeting that starts with 1, and I asked for help with lunch, I was provided the $23 limit myself in writing that I was permitted to spend, that the staff provided me. So what I want to know is, before these have been reimbursed, has staff reviewed all of them to make sure that they are within the limits?
Yeah, so Coco, I don't know if you're able to speak to that, but they are reviewed by our Office of Finance. And then also just Trustee Tony, to your point, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, there are travel times for which those are approved. So breakfast, we have to be traveling before 7 a.m., for example, to be reimbursed for that.
Yeah, actually they are reviewed by General Service Office, then to Finance. In a way, like it had like those all went through like different layers of review. And in accordance with the state bar's like travel policy.
Okay, and these to me sound like they're based on the CONUS, the federal,
Correct.
continental U.S. Guidelines that actually have it varied by city. And so I'm familiar with these. I'm familiar with these amounts because of my own travel and my own organization's policies. And what can you say about hotel accommodations and how those expenses are determined to be reasonable?
Sure. So there's pre-approved rates for different locations. Obviously, San Francisco is higher than other areas, and so we have a higher reimbursement rate. So if there's a hotel that exceeds that rate, so in San Francisco, for example, the prices are often impacted because there's events and so forth. Individuals have to seek authorization to go above and beyond the particular amount that's authorized for the area in which they're traveling.
And that's determined on a case-by-case basis?
Correct. It's with their supervisor's approval and so forth.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much. I think these are important questions to have answered when the public asks about them. Are there any other questions from any other audit committee member? In that case, I would entertain a motion to approve item 3.1, which I'm presuming, yeah, thank you for the screen sharing. I'm wondering if there is a mismatch. This is so interesting. The one that I downloaded had approval of 2024, quarter 2. But this is in Okay, this is this is in conformance to what I have. So thank you for putting that on the screen. And I'd entertain a motion to approve.
I'll make the motion.
Trustee Huser, thank you for making the motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Trustee Harrison, thank you. May we have the roll call, Angela?
Bonaventura,
Aye.
Harrison,
Aye.
User,
Aye.
Stevens,
Aye.
Tony.
Aye.
The motion carries.
Thank you. It appears, since we called roll, that trustees Buenaventura and trustee Stevens has arrived. Is there anything more you need to do, Secretary, other than to note that? Very good, thank you.
Can the record reflect it wasn't my fault that I was late?
Of course it can. You'll blame it on the transportation system, perhaps? All right, so noted. Thank you for attending, Trustee Stevens. So the next item we have is item 3.2, if we can get that on the screen, and that's approval of Q2 for 2025 board and management travel expenses. And happy to accept a motion for that.
I'll make the motion.
Thank you, Trustee Huser, for moving the item. Do we have a second?
Second.
I'll take it.
Okay, I have Trustee Stevens as seconding it. I think we're prepared to have a roll call, please.
Bonaventura,
Aye.
Harrison,
Aye.
User,
Aye.
Stevens,
Aye.
Tony.
Aye.
The motion carries.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. So we are going to go to our business agenda. Yep, please.
We did miss the minutes, item 2.
We missed the minutes. We sure did. Thank you. You know what? That is so strange.
Maybe at the bottom.
Hold on. Yes, they are. Thank you for reminding me that I skipped over the minutes. So what I have here is item 2.1, which is approval of the May 14th, 2025 open session minutes. Is that the one? Okay, if you could kindly, Madam Secretary, put that on the screen. Okay. This was included in our board packets, the minutes. Does anyone have any additions or questions about the May 14th? That was our most recent audit committee meeting. Hearing none, I would accept a motion to approve the May 14th, 2025 open session minutes of the Audit Committee.
So moved.
Trustee Stevens, thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
Trustee Buenaventura, thank you.
Yes, sir.
We have a second. I would ask Madam Secretary to call the roll.
Bonaventura,
Aye.
Harrison,
Abstain.
User,
Aye.
Stevens,
Aye.
Tony.
Aye.
The minutes have been adopted.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the reminder, Erica. I do appreciate it. So the next thing on the agenda is we're moving to the business agenda. Item 4.1, the update and progress report on the generative AI governance and usage.
Helen Peterson, who's joining us and has been promoted.
Thank you. Please, Helen,
Hi,
take it away.
Hi, everybody. My name is Helen Peterson. I lead our Office of Operational and Digital Transformation, which sits in the Executive Office. I'm going to be sharing my screen, so let me get that set up. Can you all see that? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So today we're going to be talking about our generative AI usage and our governance. So this is really an update and a progress report. We're heading towards what you have all asked for in November, which is a larger generative AI governance framework. So what we're hoping to provide you today is really what are we using generative AI for today? And then really going to introduce where are we headed with our governance framework to get some directional feedback from you all. So let me jump into exactly what we'll be going over today. So I'm going to be presenting our State Bar Generative AI Staff Usage Inventory. So this is a live document that we're keeping of everywhere that we are using generative AI. We're going to spotlight a great use case that we are using generative AI for, which is translating complaints. We will go over, we have recently updated our staff guidelines for using generative AI. So we'll go over those changes. And then we'll give you a look ahead. So what are we working on? What's going to be coming in the next couple of months? Okay. So we'll start with our generative AI staff usage inventory. I do want to highlight here, this is really how our staff are using generative AI. And all of the tools that you're seeing on your screen are tools that we are paying for, and around that are all of these kind of, confidentiality protections and contracting protections that we have it. So these are not things that we're, just using willy-nilly outside of our own agreements. So I think what I really want to highlight here is we have been, testing and piloting several generative AI tools over the last year. Some of those have been successful, and then others, VLEX and Paxton are good examples. We tried and we kind of decided they did not meet our accuracy and efficiency needs. So we cut those contracts. So what I do want to highlight here is the platforms that we're using today. So you'll see Claude, which I don't know, I'm sure you guys are pretty familiar with that. It's very similar to ChatGPT. We're using that for translating OCTC complaints that are submitted in Spanish. That will be the spotlight that I highlight in the next couple of slides. And over on the right column, you'll see all of these. We are at a stage where everything that's coming out of a generative AI tool is getting a thorough human review. This first instance with Claude, the OCTC complaints, we do have a policy that outlines how, if Claude was performing well enough, how could we get out of human review? However, we are tracking very closely Claude's performance on this, and we are not anywhere near getting out of human review. So a couple of the other ways we are using it on this inventory, the next level for Claude, and then this OpenAI Studio Chat Playground, those are general purpose assistants. So when we think about ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, but we have these are secure. So this means that we can use them with documents that have confidential information. We also are using Spellbook, which is a procurement contract drafting and review tool. A great way we would use this is maybe putting in 10 contracts and asking it, please develop a table that outlines how these terms and conditions compare. So that's where we can really start speeding up our work in our comparative analysis. The next one is we already are using Westlaw for research, and they now have an optional generative AI search function. I would say this doesn't have a high adoption rate. People aren't really happy with, but it's something that's there. And the kind of more traditional search function is still within Westlaw, which is where we're seeing staff use it more often. And then the last one, which is very exciting, we are looking at the GitHub Copilot tool. And this is a very common use case on the market in terms of where generative AI is being used. These tools can be used to find bugs. They can do quality assurance. They can do testing. So, and all of this is for computer programming. So our IT teams and our data teams are really using this to improve their work and really bring more quality to their work. Now, I did want to let everybody know kind of how do we purchase these systems. So the big picture here is a lot of teams at the state bar are involved before we can actually get one of these systems. So OGC reviews the terms, they review the use case, they review kind of how we're going to use it. The procurement team, has their role in this, and then we have cybersecurity professionals in IT that are looking at how is our data stored, how is it being used. Across all of these systems, there is a security infrastructure review, so encryption, access, data transmission. Confidentiality is a huge part of this. So we will go over how is data handled, how are the procedures laid out. And then the last one, which is pretty specific to generative AI right now, is training data restrictions. So the way generative AI works is it's really learning from itself. And when we buy a tool like this, we have to ensure that it's not learning from our data. So nothing about our data is going back into this system to train it. So that is what all three of these conditions have to be met before we'll move forward with the product. And it's also something we continually review as terms and conditions change. Okay, so I'll talk briefly about this great use case where we are using Claude, which is again similar to ChatGPT, and it's a confidential. We're able to upload confidential information into it because of our contract with them. We are using Claude to make translating complaints more efficient. Now let's talk about why this was a good use case. So we get a lot of OCTC complaints that are submitted in Spanish, and so it's high volume, it's time sensitive. We need those, translations turned around very quickly, and alternatives are very expensive to contract this out. So what we did, we started with a very rigorous testing framework to test the main language models that were on the market at the time to see which one performed the best. So we did ChatGPT, Gemini, and Claude 3 Opus. And we ranked and we measured their performance before we selected Claude as the system that we would use to do this. The other thing is that we created a really comprehensive policy document that outlined it and defined, what is a major error versus a minor error? What are our progressive human review stages? So how could we ever get out of needing human review every single time? Spoiler alert, we are not anywhere near that. Everything needs a human review every single time. And then we established error tracking systems, which we still use today. This has been going on for about 5-6 months now. And we track every single time we use this tool for translating complaints. And that's all to say, all of that is a pretty comprehensive policy document. And then we did a 3-month pilot where we did very targeted tracking of how Claude was performing and really tried to understand, is this the right solution for us? And then here, this is like the exciting part. We saw major efficiency gains. We achieved about a 40% productivity increase. So our certified translator, who was our pilot participant in this, said it really was an accelerator, not a replacement. But he saw a 40% increase in his efficiency. And then I will say the great work that was done on this policy and kind of how we approached it really also informed our generative AI framework that I'll be showing later. So another thing that we're getting out ahead of is making sure staff are equipped with the guidelines and kind of parameters for how should they be using generative AI. So in July, we've updated our interim guidelines for the use of generative AI to provide a bit more clear direction. And I will say the reason we're still kind of using the word interim is, as we all know, generative AI is changing so quickly that we do want this policy to be rather nimble. So we've updated it 3 or 4 times as things have changed on the market. So this change we provided a more robust definition of what confidential information means so that people just have a really clear idea of where can they put certain information and what systems can it go in. We also, before we kind of told people, experiment, don't use confidential information, but use what's on the market. We kind of are limiting what we want people to be using based on the Stanford University Center of Research, their foundation models, Air Bench 2024 standards, which is a safety framework. So Stanford is providing an assessment of how safe are each of the generative AI tools that are on the market. And based on that, we now have 4 different platforms that staff are allowed to use. And that incorporates things like bias is a part of this, these standards, and safety are part of these standards. So that was a big addition. And then finally, we gave expanded guidance on how to use AI plugins, extensions, and transcription tools. And something I will always call out, because it's something we talk about all the time, staff are always reminded that they are required to carefully review and verify all generative AI content before it is used. Okay, now we're looking ahead. This is a very exciting thing. So as many of you know, we are a Microsoft shop. So when we think about Azure and Microsoft 365, that is where a lot of our data sits. It's where our infrastructure and security sits. We've put a lot of investment in the security model around that. Microsoft Copilot Chat is a new feature that has been released by Microsoft free, kind of not free, but as a part of our existing license. So we're not paying additionally for it. And what Microsoft Copilot Chat is similar to ChatGPT and Claude, but we are allowed to upload confidential information into it because it is wrapped around the current security protocols that all of our Microsoft environment has. So we are very excited about this. We are looking to do our security teams have, evaluated and kind of tested this out, and we have been given the go-ahead to do a pilot. And so we're testing next week with a small group of staff to understand how can it be used, and the major efficiency gains. One thing I will say, we've kind of looked at this and heard from peer organizations as well. We really see this as more kind of a general assistant, so helping draft, draft emails, maybe summarize a long document. I would not say this is going to, make any kind of decisions or even be involved in any process workflows. It really will kind of like sit like a ChatGPT. So we're very excited about this because it does allow us to scale generative AI usage across the agency in a way we have not done so yet. Okay. The other thing that we're doing is we are, tracking regulation and just kind of developments that are happening in the Gen AI in the space. So, we're checking out what the California Judicial Council ruling addressed, but we're also looking at like what are other states doing, what are other state bars doing. The city of San Jose is something we look towards. They are generative AI policy leaders. And then also just Europe takes a very risk-managed approach to AI. So Stephen, who's our cybersecurity person, and I are kind of constantly looking to other organizations to inform what should our frameworks look like, what should our guidelines look like. And we will continue to do that. Okay. And this is kind of the last thing to talk about today. So below here, this is the generative AI governance framework. These bullets below, you all are probably familiar with it. It is what you ask staff to do. So what you've asked us to do is create this generative AI governance framework that addresses reporting guidelines, documentation of use cases, which we've already started doing, risk assessments and performance metrics, a post-launch monitoring framework, and thinking about how we regularly evaluate AI systems. And then you ask for staff to present regular updates about how we're using these tools. So what I'm going to present, I have a couple slides here. Like I said, we are working towards that November meeting with you all. What I'm going to show you is where we're at currently with it, in the hopes of getting directional feedback that this is what you were looking for. So I will kind of present this graphic. So this is what we are thinking about when we think about a governance framework. There's 3 parts. The first is really, how do we select and implement AI? The second is, what do we do once it's been launched? How do we monitor it? And the third is, how do we keep you all informed? So what is our reporting structure and what is our cadence? So I'll start with 1 here, which is, again, how do we identify use cases? How do we identify, how do we select a system? And then how do we launch? We've broken this out into 4 different steps. The first is really the identify. And here is what we're doing is trying to identify what are the use cases at our organization that could be prime for a generative AI solution. So we'll be keeping a inventory of those potential use cases. And we hear these things from staff. It also comes from my office. IT has ideas, so we'll be keeping it there. The other thing we'll be doing is creating an intake form where we really review the business case. So is this something that will improve our operations? Is it worth the investment? The idea with this one is it will go in tandem with the intake form that IT already uses with staff. So we don't want these to be two separate processes, but rather one that kind of comes together. And then we'll go to select the solution and the approval process. So this is where we are proposing that we set up a generative AI review staff committee that will approve the use cases and solution selection. So this is where we're kind of putting some, approvals and governance into this process. So as a part of that, the person, the team, including my office, will be creating a solution selection and approval report. That is really where we're going to be identifying, what are our potential risks? Where is our ROI on this? This is where we're going to be evaluating, is this even worth pursuing? And what are the risks associated with it? The other thing we'll be doing as part of this is keeping that generative AI usage inventory. One of the things, just a bigger goal is if we already are paying for a solution that could solve a different use case, we'd rather use that than trying to, buy a lot of different things. So that's where that will come into play. And then when we go to implement, this is where we really want to bring standardization and to this part. So there will be a project policy template, which is very inspired by what we did with the Claude translation pilot. So this is where people will really need to identify, what are our risks? How are we going to manage those risks? What are our key performance indicators to tell us if the system is performing and actually helping us? How are we logging? And so this is where the team's going to really have to go through and say, how are we logging issues? How do we define issues? And then they'll also document what is the human review protocol. So is it every single time? Is there a way, if the system gets it right 1,000 times in a row, could we maybe go to periodic reviews? But really outlining the review protocols here. The other thing we'll do is how do we test for these things? This will include bias testing. And then finally, we want to standardize how we do pilots so that we have an idea before they go to launch, how they're performing. The second part, measure and monitor. This is another approval body. So this would be after post-launch. We want to conduct semi-annual reviews of the tools that we have in use. So we would have semi-annual general assessment reports and a governing and an oversight panel that would go in and do these reviews. And then at the bottom, you'll see, this reporting structure and cadence. You were proposing, my office does a generative AI semi-annual audit committee report. And this is just kind of another way, this is similar information, just another way to think about it. So our pre-launch documentation, like the intake form, will identify our KPIs. The solution selection and approval report will identify those risks and potential for bias. And then the policy document is where we, develop those plans, we establish those protocols. And then that all informs the post-launch monitoring. So we go back to that documentation to say, did any of these risks come to fruition? Did, how are we going to continue to test for bias because things do develop and change? And so the first thing that we'll do is in the post-launch is a performance summary memo template. So 30, 60, and 90 days out, we'll synthesize our findings of what has happened so far, and we'll share those with the leadership team. The other one is a semi-annual generative AI assessment report. So that's every 6 months. And this will be a standardized template where we kind of go back to those risks, back to those KPIs to say, should we continue to use this and inform operational decisions? And at the bottom, this is kind of what a summary would look like. So you'd have those performance memos for the first 3 months, and then it would move to 6 months. So all of this is to take a very, risk-averse approach to generative AI that also integrates with our existing IT approaches. And that is all I have today. I am happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. That was a very satisfying presentation that covered a lot of ground, both in breadth and in depth. So opening it up to my colleagues, Audit Committee members, what questions might you have?
I have a question.
Yes, please, Trustee Harris. No, is it Harrison or Buenaventura?
Buenaventura.
Okay, Buenaventura, please.
Yes. Thank you. My apologies for not being on screen. I'm on my way to the next meeting there. But so first, let me obviously say that was a great presentation, and that I think AI is really our future, and it's the way to go, and it makes things more efficient and productive. But I have some concerns about it. And so I guess the bottom line of my question is are we able to say to the public that complaints that come into the bar, that the decision on the complaints are never going to be made by AI? And that we can say it with great confidence that complaints will always be humanly reviewed along the process, and that no decisions are made by AI. And then with respect to the process itself and how complaints come in and how we start this AI progression of how we start to figure out what the complaint is about and take action. In my practice, I use Lexis a lot, and I know that there is a system where you can pretty much download or upload the opposition motion, and AI will start to dissect it, and you can come up with authority and things like that. So are we talking about, let's say a complaint is brought in either by telephone or by email, that we feed that into some kind of AI platform, and then from there, AI will suggest the course of action to take? Or are we still involved humanly in every step of the way, and that we're not leaving it up to AI to sort of set the tone and direction of where complaints go? So that's really my concern, is I want to know how much we're going to rely on it versus how much we're still going to have oversight, human review on it. Because I certainly don't want us to be in a position where a complaint is started and stopped by AI, that AI makes that decision. And so I'll take my answer off the air. Just those are my comments. Thank you.
Trustee Tony, if I may.
Please.
So that is not currently being contemplated, Trustee Buenaventura. We are, I think we have talked about potential for the future, and we are looking at how that could work, but there is no automated decision making being done as it relates to complaints. What Helen was describing earlier is that portions of the complaints come in to OCT, or portions or all of the complaints come into OCTC, and they're in Spanish. And the majority of OCTC's attorneys are not Spanish speakers. And so we have translators who are using Claude to translate from Spanish into English the complaint. They are reviewing it every time. And then that complaint that has been translated into English is then provided to an OCTC attorney. In the same vein, once that information is prepared in English to be communicated back to the complaining witness, if that person is a Spanish speaker, it is then translated back into Spanish and reviewed by the translator to be then shared with that complaining witness in their native language. So that is what is being done currently. If there were to be automated decision-making, you raised it as an always or never statement. That would be something that would be presented through to the Board of Trustees as something to be determined as to if ever it would be without a human in the loop.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question, Trustee Buenaventura, and thank you Erica very much for the response. Other questions? Well, I'll start by saying that I think one of the things, and this follows Trustee Buenaventura's question, is it would be useful for the November meeting to see what is the list of items that are off limits to AI. What are the things, there was one example presented that we as trustees should expect AI never to be used by the state bar staff? What are the boundaries, in other words, and I think that would be a useful thing for us to see. And I think you doing that will preempt some questions and concerns that I think trustees and the public may reasonably have about what the use, the presentation that you presented, Helen Peterson, was very much of a use of AI that is very, very thoughtful, that is measured, and that has guardrails, particularly the human review. I certainly support and would like the trustees to have advance notice if there was thought of human review being eliminated in any of these areas. But it also would be nice to know what are the things that AI will not be used for, that the staff, at least at this point, has determined are on the, out of limits for AI.
Yeah, we can add that for November.
Thank you. Thank you. Other questions trustees may have? While you're all thinking, I've had this presentation before and it asked some questions. And one of the questions I asked was about, AI is used by a lot, AI is used by a lot of people and a lot of parties. And some of the parties that use AI are those who have interest in seeking private information, in breaking in to systems like the state bar for various reasons, for the confidential information that we possess. We have in the past had incidents where either deliberately or by happenstance, state bar private information was made public. And so one of the things I have interest in, and this is something we don't need a long discussion on today, but for November, is an idea of what, from a cybersecurity standpoint, is the State Bar doing to protect our databases from AI-assisted attacks and attempted breaches of our systems? And I see Pettis is on the meeting. I was hoping that he was on in anticipation of my question.
Thank you for that question, Trustee Tony. Yes, and I think that we are doing a number of things in the cybersecurity areas to making sure that we are, very thoughtful about all the different possibilities. And this is one area that you cannot ever do enough, quite frankly speaking. So I think that's really, and one of my personal goal in having Stephen join us is to create visibility in terms of all the different systems and measures that are in place, and what are the risks that are potentially applicable to our state bar organization, and then what measures are we taking to mitigate those risks as well. So I think that will be a really good I could partner with as part of Helen's or a separate item if as you may want to be giving you visibility on that. And just wanted to share with the audit committee as well is that we just went through the selection for audit and assessment external vendor partner, which will be doing a 360 or whatever degrees we can apply, a whole full spectrum of assessment and analysis for us to be able to look at our practices, our tools, give us recommendations, and how we can shore up and strengthen our posture overall. So that should also be, we're aiming for that to be ready in November as well. So we have a lot more information for you to share with you, Trustee Tony and all the trustees and the audit committee members.
Thank you very much, Paras Gupta. You do us proud as Chief Technology Officer for the State Bar. So thank you very much. Any other questions from trustees? Okay. Well, I want to thank the staff for the thorough presentation today. And this is a discussion-only item. There is no action to be taken. So with that, I am going to close this agenda item and move on to our next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So our next item is item 4.2, which is approval of the fiscal year 2024 single audit. And I believe we have a presentation that will be provided by Joyce Song from MGO.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Welcome.
Let me go ahead and share my screen.
Thank you.
And just
Joyce, would you introduce yourself and your role for MGO, please?
absolutely. Just about to do that. My name is Joyce Song. I'm a program director at the Office of Access and Inclusion. And I am here with Annie Louie, who is a partner at Macias, Gini, and O'Connell, who will join me in sharing the results of our 2024 fiscal year audit, single audit results. Can you all see the screen, by the way?
We sure can. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, fabulous. And I apologize if my camera is sort of facing the wrong direction. Okay. Oh. So before I hand it off to Annie, I did just want to set you up with a little bit of background and context on the single audit. The single audit is required by Title II of the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations. And of course, its purpose is to ensure that federal awards are used responsibly and in accordance with federal rules and regulations. It's required for non-entities, and in this case, that is us, the State Bar, who receives federal funds over $750,000 in fiscal year 2024. That dollar amount has increased for 2025 to 1 million, and it's not expected that we will meet that threshold. And so we don't expect to have a single audit after this, at least for the next fiscal year. We have received a federal funds as a pass-through from two agencies, and we have then re-granted those to qualified legal aid organizations across California. The funds come from the COVID-19 coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds that were passed through the Judicial Council of California. And they also come from the COVID-19 homeowner assistance funds passed through the California Housing Finance Agency Homeowner Relief Corporation. As the name implies, the name of these funds imply these are pandemic relief funds that were targeting homeowners, home security. So homeowners and renters during the pandemic to ensure that they were housed through legal aid services. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Annie, who will get into the details of the single audit. And Annie, just let me know when you want me to shift the slides.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Annie Louie. I am a partner from Macias, Gini O'Connell, leading the State Bar's audit engagement for fiscal year 2024. I'm very excited to be here to present to you the audit results. Although I have to say, the AI item is one hard one to follow because it is so exciting. So I will try to make this as interesting for you as I can. As Joyce had mentioned in her portion of the presentation, we did go through the single audit, which is an audit of compliance with federal requirements for the State Bar's federal awards. For fiscal year 24, total expenditures, federal expenditures, totaled $31.1 million under the two federal programs that were mentioned. Of that amount, the majority of it, or $30.5 million, were passed due to subrecipients, so qualifying agencies that received the respective funding for those two programs. As we go through the uniform guidance requirements, we did have to select one major program, which is the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. And that program had total federal expenditures of $26.9 million. And as you can see, that was the majority of the State Bar's federal expenditures for fiscal year 24. And of that amount, $26.5 million were passed due to subrecipients. Next slide, please. So I thought it would be good to provide an overview of the single audit process. So for people who may not be familiar with the requirements, to better understand what happens under a single audit. The U.S. Office of Management and Budget, OOMB for short, is the federal agency that sets forth the audit requirements for a single audit, and many of you will probably be familiar with the term, the uniform guidance. The uniform guidance provides the requirements on how major programs are selected. Is quite prescriptive. It provides a formula of determining what is considered a type A or larger dollar amount program, and what is type B or the smaller dollar amount program. That threshold does fluctuate from year to year based on total expenditures for the federal agency. And based on the segregation of the different programs, there are a list of risk factors that we have to go through to consider whether a program is considered high risk or low risk. And high risk programs would have to be tested. And that is how the major program was selected for the State Bar's fiscal year 24 audit. Once we have selected the major program for testing, we go through the grant requirements. So all the requirements that are listed in the uniform guidance. The OMB does issue an annual compliance supplement that provides the minimum audit requirements that are expected for auditors to perform. So we followed the compliance supplement requirements, as well as any grant requirements that might be specified in the grant agreement from your grantor, to determine what we consider to be direct and material compliance requirements for testing. Under a single audit, we are also required to test controls over compliance. So we also look into the control structure surrounding compliance with the particular requirement, and we perform testing thereon. After that, once we have conducted our testing, we summarize the results and discuss that with management and prepare the final report. Next slide, please. So I'm happy to report, and this is the exciting part, that the State Bar did not have any audit findings. We issue an unmodified opinion, which means a clean opinion, no limitations whatsoever on the audit report. And we also did not identify any deficiency in internal controls over compliance that would be reported to you otherwise. Going on to the next one, this is where I end my presentation. I think in this case, no news is good news, meaning that there were no findings, no deficiencies, or other observations that would warrant us bringing it to your attention. I will take any questions that you might have at this point.
Please, any questions that anybody has? This is the time. Well, while people are thinking, first, Andy Louie, I want to say what a very efficient presentation. Really appreciate the thoroughness at which you conducted the audit. This is great news. This is great news because it's an example and evidence of the state bar staff. And it really is the staff that is responsible for the day-to-day operations of the state bar. This really is a testament to the dedication, competence, and just skill level of the state bar staff. So this, I want to make sure that the executive director conveys this to the staff from the audit committee that this is outstanding news and we do notice it. And we want to make sure everybody else who is watching the state bar that despite missteps and mistakes that we certainly have made and must take responsibility for, there's a great deal of the bulk of the day-to-day work that may not be glamorous and may not get a lot of attention, but does deserve to be noted. And this is one of them. Any questions from any other questions or comments from any other trustees here? Okay, well, given that I don't see any questions, I would ask Madam Secretary to place the agenda of the resolution proposal on the board. Okay. So I am happy to accept a motion to approve the fiscal year 2024 single audit pursuant to, the rest of the motion as presented.
I'll make the motion.
Thank you, Trustee Huser. Happy to hear a second.
Second.
All right, Trustee Stevens gets in for the second. If I could ask the secretary to do a roll call vote?
Bonaventura,
Aye.
Person,
Aye.
User,
Aye.
Aye.
Tony.
Aye.
The motion carries.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate it. Thank you, Joyce Song, and thank you, Annie Louie, for your presentation. We appreciate it very much, and for your work in making this audit happen. Appreciate it. Okay. What I have next on the agenda is item 4.3, which is the discussion, review, and possible action on the 2025 Audit Committee Annual Work Plan. And I sure would appreciate Erica Doherty walking us through this conversation.
Happy to do so.
Thank you.
So this item is on your agenda. As you recognize, we are in Q3, soon to be Q4 of 2025. So this item is largely just to go through the work plan, share anything that has been completed, as well as if there's anything that remains outstanding for the audit committee to explore. As you heard in the item earlier, item 4.1 regarding AI usage, that is something, for example, that is not yet complete and you will be receiving back in November. So I believe, Angela, if you wouldn't mind sharing. And I will note just at the top, it appears that there was a misprint. It says 2026. This is our 2025 work plan.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so going to the first item, that is now complete. That is that single audit that you just heard a presentation on earlier and you just accepted, and that can be checked off the list, if you will.
Yay.
All right, next on the agenda is, or on the work plan, excuse me, is the cybersecurity audit. This is something that will come back. So this was done in Q2 with review by the chair of the audit committee, and we'll come back in Q4 to review findings and recommendations to determine if there were additional steps and so forth. This was alluded to by Paras Gupta in the earlier presentation related to AI. Okay, next is the state audit. This is something that was done as part of the, when we received the audit earlier this year. It will come back again at the end of the year to review any outstanding items that have been pending more than a year that were recommendations from our state auditor. I will just say, tied to this, I have good news to report. We do have a new lead in our Office of Compliance. She has been with us now for just about 3 weeks or so, but I'm hopeful that she'll be able to attend and present that item when it comes back in November.
Excellent.
All right, the next is the Legal Services Trust Fund grant audits. This is another item that was presented back in May and has been resolved and completed. And then finally, finally in this section, excuse me, is the annual financial statement audit. This will be coming back on schedule to the audit committee at its November meeting. All right, we are now in the ethics and accountability section. But all of these items have been completed. So item 1 was an update on the whistleblower anti-retaliation program reporting. Item 2 was the public trust liaison's annual report that was shared at the May meeting. And then moving on, this item, the identification of the uncertified lawyer referral services and possible enforcement mechanisms, there was a presentation on that at the May meeting. It was determined at that time that given the resources that would be associated with engaging in proactive enforcement of uncertified LRSs, that it was not going to be pursued. All right, oversight and governance, monitoring and internal controls, the review of the quarterly expense reports. You did that earlier today. That will again come back in November for the Q3. And then review of Office of Compliance activities. This is slated for Q3, which would have been this meeting. However, because, as I mentioned, we have a new lead in the Office of Compliance, we are going to be deferring that until later this year. I am excited that you will get a lot of input and as far as what the plans are largely for the future, considering that it will have been just a few, frankly, weeks still since our new compliance person has been on board. And then the AI governance oversight, that is the presentation that you heard from Helen Peterson earlier today. So that was about the current use cases as well as the proposed governance framework. The governance framework itself, the recommendations for that will be presented back to the audit committee at its November meeting. And then finally, a good segue as we near the end of 2025, what will come back in November is starting to think about next year's 2026 Audit Committee annual work plan that will ultimately be approved by the Board Executive Committee. And that is the entire work plan, Chair.
Thank you very much for that presentation. It's actually useful. It looks like we've gotten more done than I realized. I don't know about the rest of you all, but that's good news. That's actually good news. Open it up to questions, thoughts? Okay. Well, I appreciate Erica, you walking us through this. It feels like we're on track. It really feels like the audit committee is on track to meet our obligations and to achieve our goals, and that's always a good feeling. So we have no other items that have been noticed on our agenda. Before we wrap up, is there any general question or thought that any trustee would like to share? Anything you'd like to see on the next agenda, for instance? That is always welcome. Yes, please, Trustee Stevens.
Well, I wanted to thank Chair Tony for doing a masterful job with the committee in general, because you've taken audit to the place where it needs to be, and you've put it, taken the microscope and put it on the work that is done. And it's not the glamorous stuff, but it is the really, really important stuff. So I want to thank you for making us dive deeper and getting it done right.
That's awful kind of you, Trustee Stevens. I appreciate your kind words of encouragement. I will tell you, I love serving on audit committees. Every board I join, I volunteer for the audit committee because it is important. I believe that it's absolutely essential for any good organization, well-run organization, to have a strong audit committee. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And with that, I believe we are done, and I am going to call this meeting adjourned. Thank you, everybody.